Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you're all doing fine. I hope you're all doing well. Thanks for joining us in this virtual format. It's been kind of nice to continue to do these lectures despite all of the complications, but we're so glad that you can join us tonight. So welcome to the Lubalin lecture series, and the presentation tonight is Rendering 25 Years with Peter Bain. My name is Alexander. I'm one of the instructors in the typographer program, which is presenting today's talk. For those who may not be familiar, the typographer is a postgraduate certificate program in typeface design, and the program has a dedicated lecture series. So this event is part of that annual lecture series that we've had going back to the first year of the program, which was 2010. So it's been a long running series, which has been really fun to put together these lectures, and it's incredible that we can share this now with a much bigger audience as well. So thank you for all of us, to all of you, for joining us and keeping this sort of expanded circle going. So it's really nice to have more new people. The lectures are part of the offerings that we have, kind of part of the public offerings we have. We also have, within the typographer programs, we have the dedicated typeface design program in a certificate program, I should say, in the typeface design. We also have workshops devoted to type design, to lettering, typography, and we also organize the typographics conference and festival every year, which you should see notification of the new event, a new virtual event for this coming summer, announced this week. So keep an eye out for that. You can find out more information about the program on our website, and I will post the link to that in the chat. There we go. Got to multitask. We also we're closing out this cycle of the lectures for this term. So we have 3 terms during the year, and we tend to have 4 lectures in each term. So this is the second term that's closing. We will have 4 more lectures in June and July coming up. So keep an eye on the our website to find out more lectures as soon as they're posted. Probably within a month or so, you should be able to see more lectures announced. We also have an incredibly extensive video archive of talks going back at least 5, now 6 years. And to see that, you can go to our dedicated Vimeo page, and as well as the past lecture listings on the Cooper website, on typographer website. You can just scroll down to the past lectures, and there's a link embedded. The video recording of this talk will also be available within a week or so. So if you follow the link, you can find the recording of this. So if you are wondering later if it's being recorded, it will definitely be recorded and available and added to our collection of lectures. Just some housekeeping stuff. There's no need to keep your video or audio off. It's a webinar format, so all of that is disabled. So certainly use the chat and the Q&A. So the Q&A will be how we're going to take questions. So send your questions using the Q&A button in the Zoom. And when you're chatting, just be mindful that there's two kind of toggles. There's panelists and attendees and panelists. If you send a message to panelists, then it's only really going to the technical crew. If you want to have a chat with the rest of the group or with everyone in attendance, make sure it's selected to panelists and attendees. But questions directed to Peter, send them over to the Q&A. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Peter Bain. Peter Bain is a designer and typographer who started work on Madison Avenue and 59th Street in Manhattan, here in New York City. His work has been recognized by the AIGA and the Type Directors Club. It's been published in Communication Arts and magazines. His calligraphic book, Writing Knowledge, is in the Library Special Collections at Princeton University and the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Peter has taught classes and led workshops in Alabama, Georgia, LA, Mississippi, and New York. And on a personal note, I met Peter a little bit more than 20 years ago when I was lucky enough to work with him and Paul Shaw on this amazing exhibition devoted to the history and context around Black letter. So I've known Peter for many years, and this is an important marker in my life. It kind of introduced me to this world of type design, but also to type design history. So I'm really glad to have Peter back through sort of the Lubalin connection. I'm physically in the Lubalin Center, so we're doing this like virtual reunion, so to speak, in around a different topic. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us.
Great, great. Okay, so let me go ahead and get my presentation going. Okay, hold on. Great, and we're going to just bump over to my desktop for a brief second. We there? We good?
It's not shared yet, Peter.
Oh, okay. We had this problem before. Let's try it again. Are we working now?
Yep, that's
okay, great, fantastic. Okay, so when I was we were emailing back and forth with Alexander about what would be an interesting topic, and this is something I've been interested in, and it comes even though I didn't start on Madison Avenue until the mid 80s, 1985 actually. That there was still this sort of lettering culture in the background that I was interested in. And little did I know that it was kind of going away while I was literally there. But I'll be talking both about things I've learned since then, as well as some contacts I've had with people when I was there that were involved with it at that point. And very much kind of trying to what people knew about letterform design, what people knew about wordmark design, what people thought about lettering, and why lettering was important in that specific sort of New York context. I'm not going to be talking a lot about broad pen lettering or calligraphy. That will come in, but that was also very important. And I'm also very much interested in talking about lettering instruction, because the idea is what were the things that people were being taught or people thought were important. And even things like what was, harbingers of when the Adobe Trajan font came out later, it became really popular. And before then, there's a reason why that typeface really met a need. So this is a great illustration. It was an age of print. This is an illustration by W.A. Dwiggins. This is not a real place. This is concept art for a heroic printing plant. It's a multi-story inking unit, and it's totally imaginary. No printing plant I've ever been in or was in had this huge glass roof with greenhouse glass letting bright sunlight in, and press workers in a newspaper press room had to wear hats you may have heard about because they were dirty. There was ink in the air. And just to also preface this, at this time also, starting from 1945, 1970, broadcast media was very important. Radio was already established part of the American landscape. But television was growing in importance, and by the 60s and 70s was probably, the sort of leading media form, and was definitely eating into print in some ways. So this is very much a romantic view of what was going on.
Peter, if I could just stop you for a second. I think we're not seeing the full screen presentation, and we may not be getting the slide changes. If you could end the screen share and start it again on desktop one, I think that'll fix it.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, everybody. Okay, I've ended the screen share. Starting on desktop one. Are we good?
Yeah. I think that's better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so what were other applications of letter forms? Signage, right? I have just two examples of signage. This is one of them. And it also shows that custom signage was something that was existing at that time. So this is from Raymond Ballinger's book. We'll talk about that more later. But custom signage in a modernist vein was also something that was available at that time. And this is a famous book by Alexei Brodovich. And Brodovich is known as being an art director, But this is very much, I think, custom lettered. And he also obviously designed an alphabet for photo lettering. And I think it's entirely possible that although he may have art directed this, he may also have done the lettering himself. And this is exactly a good example of why you would have custom lettering in those days. And also now, because you'll notice things like the serifs on the E line up with the serifs on the T in ballet, and the low crossbar on the capital A. All those details are things you can really adjust carefully in hand lettering. And the typefaces of the time, although there was photo typesetting, it was only for headlines, and it was a pretty rare, at least when it started, it was a pretty rare specialty. I'll talk a little bit about that more later. All right, so coming out in 1945, it's the end of World War II. And as a result, there was some, given the trauma of World War II and the effect that it had on people's families, Americans with relatives from Europe, refugees from the war, the home front experience in the United States. I'm not even getting into all the things that were happening at that time. So there was sometimes a little bit of honesty that would peek through. And so although this is meant to be humorous or ironic, right now we're living, unfortunately, in a time of pestilence. That's the old-fashioned name for COVID-19. Unfortunately, we have famine, we have grim, bloody warfare, and I'm not even going into all the other problems that we have today. So it is sort of interesting to see this show up in a lettering book. This is from Helm Watzko's book on hand lettering, but it shows that there were other things going on in the background of people's lives. It wasn't just a beautiful letter forms. All right, so what was the need? Prior to digital publishing and desktop publishing, you had to design an ad. In this case, I'm taking advertising as sort of a baseline. And these are photos from Don May's 101 roughs from the mid-50s. And it shows the basic process of how you would visualize an ad before the ad existed. Now, in this case, they're starting at the top left. They already have a photo, but it could just as well be an illustration of a photo to get approval to hire a photographer. And then obviously you may not know the final text, so you have to sort of, what they would say, Greek in the body text. And you could also sketch in where the headline might go. And this is before it was typeset, or as we'll get to, before it was hand lettered. So the whole problem, quote unquote, that you had at that time is, how do you visualize an ad before the ad is created? And definitely before it runs in the newspaper or the magazine. And that was where the skill in comping, what they used to call comping lettering or sketching lettering, was necessary. This is another example from the same book where the Dwiggins illustration showed you earlier. And here we can see that Dwiggins has indicated the headline, "Ask the bees on the blossoms if sunshine makes the clover sweet." Just to read the obvious, he probably would hand letter this himself, or would envision an art director would have this hand lettered rather than be set in type. So there's very much an expectation that there was a lot of hand lettering at that time, for any one of a number of reasons. You can learn more about that in the, if you go in the Type at Cooper archive, video archive, and see Charles Nix's talk on George Abrams, and you'll get a very specific look at specific work by one designer. One of the important stages was laying out a very tight tissue, and this was done on tracing paper, of the final lettering. And this is from Mortimer Leach's book, Lettering for Advertising. And this is sort of where, one of the places where the sort of the idea of the designer sketch becomes very important. Leach was a master of lettering. His lettering appeared in ads for Chevrolet Motors, Mobil Gas, and other companies. And here you can see the precision of his letter forms that look like they're typefaces. They weren't. They were all custom drawn, so he could vary the size and the weight and the proportion of the letter forms. And he has taken the tissue here, or the tracing, and he has put soft lead on the back in preparation of transferring from the tracing to the artboard. And then the artboard, or on the Bristol, is where you would actually draw the lettering. This is an example from David Gates's book, Lettering for Reproduction, which was published at the end of the time period we're looking at. And you can see here the inking in process, where first you would draw careful outlines, and then you would go back and fill weight, but you would also make some final adjustments. And there might also be a little bit of retouching with white at the end of this process. Gates, along with Nesbitt and Leach, in Leach's books, also mentioned at the time there was competition with both typesetting and the early sort of photo typesetting technologies. So this was something that was happening in the background. It was definitely an economic pressure on the lettering artists, lettering designers. And it's also sort of part of the reason why there was this impulse to do sort of work, a lot of work that was supposed to look sort of typographic and perfectly finished. Although we will see some things that have rougher edges and are meant to look more like handwriting. All right. So here's a cover of a book called How to Render Roman Letter Forms. This is by Tommy Thompson. It's a name who may not be familiar even to people who have studied a lot of design history, but he was a lettering artist, and he was successful enough that he was asked to design typefaces. Some of them were cut in metal for Mademoiselle magazine. And later his typefaces were also created for photo setting. So he was considered pretty successful even coming into the beginning of this period. He published a book in the late 30s on script lettering, which was reprinted and has become sort of one of the standout books on that style. And what he's done here, the reason I'm showing you the cover, is letter forms are actually hand-rendered Caslon. Caslon was a very famous, actually it's a famous typeface, but it was a popular typeface at that time. And he's showing his sort of very sort of traditional contrast between the spaced Roman caps and then the script subhead at the top and the sort of the blocked out format. An idea of how important Thompson was is Davison's was a department store that was part of Macy's. They were out of Atlanta, Georgia. And this is some lettering that was done by Thompson. And it shows styles that people may more associate with the 60s and 70s, which is a large X-height or a large lowercase, very bold letter forms, fairly tight spacing. This is a word mark design for exterior signage. May also have been used for advertising. And Thompson was so well known that this was reproduced in an English book on lettering, commercial lettering, and also fine art calligraphy. So that just gives you an idea how well regarded he was at that time. Into his book, he has a nice little chart here. He was trying to give a historical overview and sort of show that he really knew what he was talking about. And the little X's and plus signs, those are little calligraphic notation. Type designers call this translation contrast. And it's the translation as you move the pen from one angle to another, or hold the pen at a different angle and move it in a different direction. You have the different types of shapes you can make. So, for example, what they call old style or book types on the far right, the Garamond and the Caslon, the pen is held at an angle, and the thin strokes go from the upper right to the lower left, or lower left to upper right, depending on what direction you're moving your pen. Whereas the modern typefaces are up and down, and then there's less contrast going across. But what's interesting about this is, for Thompson's purposes, he maybe was looking to get hired to do a sans serif, because he has very common sans serifs to us now, Futura and Franklin Gothic, under the heading of experiments and only for posters. So, you wouldn't want to use this for body text, would you? So very sort of conservative. And he wrote a book on layout, which was sort of intentionally did not pay attention to sort of the burgeoning modernist design of the 20th century, and sort of gave a more eclectic, almost early 20th century idea of what layout was. But he's got a nice chart here showing the different letter forms. And he would, and these are all the ones that he would cover in the book. So what were the letter forms at the time? What were the popular styles? Well, here's another example. It's the same ones, what they called Roman. Notice it's with serifs, although this example from Watzkow also has sans serifs. Italics, which are not Romans because they're slanted. Gothic, what we now call black letter, although sometimes Gothic was used to refer to sans serifs. Scripts, which in this case would be a formal script, and then block lettering, which now is better known as sans serif type. Better known as sans serifim type. So those were sort of the common styles of the time that you were expected to have in your repertoire as a lettering artist. This is an example following up from the pencil sketch that we looked at from Leach. This is from the David Gates book, Lettering from Reproduction. And one of the techniques which was taught for very quick indication of lettering was to sharpen a carpenter's pencil and then hold that at various angles and manipulate and draw with the pencil so that you could get in the top line an old style, which would be a Caslon or a Garriman, again, using common typefaces, a modern, which would be Bedoni or Dito, again, referencing common typefaces. And then the bottom is because Gates's book appeared in the late 60s, already Helvetica and typefaces like Folio and Univers were already sort of taking off. So here he's sort of drawn a even weight sans serif. And this is all done by turning and twisting the pen, twisting the pencil to create these shapes. And then the nifty trick that Gates has done as a lettering designer is he's gotten all these three words to line up and basically made all the letters the same width for each style, which is a pretty nifty trick, something you can only do in hand lettering. There were other styles in vogue at that time, and in fashion magazines, obviously, and some of them were based on 19th century, reviving 19th century decorated types. But here, these are all examples of hand lettering, and the reason they were hand lettered was that the typefaces from the 19th century weren't necessarily sharp. They'd been hadn't all been redrawn or revived yet, so this could allow an art director to get something that had a period feel to it that looked like it was from the 19th century, but was definitely suited for 20th century reproduction. The other thing that was happening is I did mention modernism, and there was definitely sort of a distinction to some extent in how lettering designers saw what they were doing and also how they understood the use of letter forms in the design process, in the sense that modernism was very clear about understanding a constructive approach, in a sense that the classical designers would say, well, you know, you have your Caslons and then you have your layout, and maybe a modernist might not make a distinction between a design of a letter form and design of a page. It was an issue of scale and texture, not one of pre-existing forms and pre-existing relationships. And this is from Eugen Nerdinger's book with Lisa Beck on alphabets for graphic designers and architects. And it's this nice sort of visual introduction to some principles of how letter forms are read. And this is a spread showing an index of the forms in the book. And Nerdinger very much is proceeding from a modern perspective, in that there's a sort of middle sort of normative letter form, and then that letter form is expanded or condensed or weight is added. In fact, the heavier weights here are stencil styles, and that is the way that they're showing an alphabet in their book. Is it's a series of variations. However, and this is something that also happens in a lot of lettering manuals, is after he gets through the serif versions and expanded and the moderns and the semi-serifs, and he gets into the italics, and all of a sudden things kind of, the consistency goes out the window. So it begins, they do include a brush letter form, which I'll talk a little bit more later, calligraphic Romans, oblique Romans, but redrawn, calligraphic italics, and then a formal script at the end, which is an extra bold that has been revived most recently by Sud-Typos by Alejandro Paul, that became an inspiration for one of their typefaces. So back to Thompson, and this shows Thompson's pencil renderings, and his point that by making literally filing the pencil down to the right weight, the right thickness, and using a variety of pencils, you can get the thickness of the letters that you want. So the tool controls the weight. And this is a very calligraphic idea. But this is the idea here, is to indicate where the type would go, not necessarily the actual font. So there's a little bit of there's a little wiggle room here. And I'm not going to get a whole lot into sort of calligraphic typefaces or calligraphic lettering, because that's its own discussion. But when he does show, and this is pretty clearly a Caslon, which was his model for a standard serif typeface, is that by using pencils filed in different sizes and different size chisel points, you can get a variety of sizes. And he noticed that he says, employ a harder lead as you decrease the size. So the idea is that you could just sort of have these ready to go. And then depending on what size you wanted your text to be, you could just sort of indicate it. And then, of course, all the hard work would have to be done by the typesetter, because they're doing this in metal, which is their problem, obviously. Alexander Nesbit, in his History and Technique of Lettering, which is another book from the time period, he also had training as a calligrapher. And so he very much includes this instruction. And here, though, he has some of the both the formal scripts and the informal scripts showing the types of speedball pens or flexible nibs that might be used, and showing the angle that the pen would be held, as well as a relationship between the thickness of the nib, that's the point, and then the way the shape would be drawn. But interestingly enough, the first alphabet in Nesbit's book is actually a Trajan Roman cap. And this was before, remember, this is before the Trajan font came out. So it was very common in a lot of lettering books, ever since Edward Johnson and other people had been promoting the idea of the Trajan capital specifically, and the Roman capital as a group, as sort of the high point of letterform design, at least in terms of the capitals from the classical period. It had become a form that people were expected to know. And so here, Nesbit's comment says this is built up, but he's got very careful details on the swelling of the strokes, how the serifs are drawn, and all these details that came from combination, we believe now, of brush written and chisels cutting into stone. But it's built up. This is not written. Raymond Ballinger also repeats the Roman capitals here with a picture of a Roman column in the background, just to make sure you get the point. However, some of the serifs here are in the wrong place, so they're extra serifs that aren't in the Trajan capitals. So he's definitely was either taking some liberties or not really paying attention exactly to the particular model he was talking about. And this whole interest in Roman capitals wasn't just in the lettering books. This is an ad from 1959 from Ford Motor Company. And evidently they didn't show the cars in the ad, which is pretty amazing for those days. And the headline is the world's most beautifully proportioned cars using Roman capitals. And this is from the Sam Marsh lettering studios. And they actually went to the point of sort of using this basically a classical letter form to sort of show you that you're going to have a really classy car. And so this is sort of setting the foundation later for Trajan to sort of take over for movie posters. And Sam Marsh Studio is interesting because it wasn't just Sam Marsh. Jeannie Wong, who was a well-respected Asian American lettering artist in New York and a Cooper Union grad, she mentioned at one point that she freelanced for Sam Marsh. I think she also worked on the 17 magazine masthead at one point. So there were other people other than the famous people in this that were working behind the scenes in these places. Admittedly, they were not always recognized, and that sort of thing. And I don't want to minimize their importance, but also not minimize the fact that they were not usually recognized or given their due. This is another lettering manual. This is from Albert Cavanaugh, and Cavanaugh's manual was in print for a long time. You can still get it. And what's interesting about this is his rendering of Caslon. But if you look at some of the details, what's fascinating about this book is there's always something wrong. And if not one thing wrong, there's 2 or 3 things wrong in his book. And I've been trying to figure this out ever since I first noticed it a zillion years ago. And one thing I can come up with is that when the book was published, the photographic lettering was already a possibility. So he may very well have been worried that people would photograph his alphabets and pass them off, or use them for their own sort of typesetting letter by letter. And so he may have intentionally made mistakes. The other one, which is even more disconcerting, was that he drew the letters wrong intentionally so that the better artists would learn that they were wrong, figure out what the problem was, and then have to go back and do the research and figure out the right way to draw the letters. So for the example here, if you look at the lowercase k, the upper right serif is the heaviest serif. That's that part where it's a triangular swell with the curved bracketed shapes. It's the heaviest serif on the whole page, and it looks out of place. And if you look at the lowercase w, it's kind of leaning a little bit to the right. And if you know anything about letterform design, you'll notice the lowercase y is also looks a little unbalanced, and the descender, that's the bottom part of the letter, is a little short. So there's all sorts of things here that are a little, to put it nicely, wonky. And that's typical in a lot of Kavanaugh's alphabets, we'll see. This is David Gates's, and he's also drawing a Caslon because that was sort of one of the go-to styles at the time. And this is sort of much more quote unquote correct, and it's more balanced, more elegant. Mortimer Leach, who we'll see later, also did a Caslon, one of which I think has been adapted for Google Fonts. But this is sort of a more, I think, well executed and more useful display serif style for hand lettering, not for type. So only meant for short phrases. Mentioned that there's different, some of the styles. For example, this is one of the modern examples. I'm not going to show a lot of these. This is from Watzkow's book, and he has a whole series of these where he always uses the phrase, always endeavor to find some interesting variation. And this shows you that what the hand lettering artists were doing was somewhat between typeface design and wordmark design, in that there's some specific interactions happening here that are very much about the word and the specific order of the letters, and how frequently certain shapes reappear and how frequently certain letters appear. So there was, so what these lettering artists were doing is the reason that they were being used for the better or the more talented lettering artists is they were being used for their ability to sort of add a level of visual interpretation or visual interest to the design. This is also from the Watzkow book. And I have my own criticisms of these letter forms, but he is showing that there are different forms of italics, which should be something anyone who's interested in typeface design should study. He has his version of sort of an old style or kind of a brush written italic on the lower left. The top right is more of a modern or a flexible pen written or an expansion italic. And then the bottom is sort of more of a Bedoni inspired italic type style italic, what's meant to look more typographic. But it wasn't just Roman letters. So even though Thompson says it's all about Roman letters, he, of course, gets off track like everybody else. And he feels, well, he's got to put Caslon italic in there because everybody needs italics. And then he was a master of script lettering, but he also put in bank script, which was a fairly well-known script typeface in that time, because that was also something that was sort of would be used where people either couldn't afford hand lettering or wanted to use an existing typeface, and they needed to be able to sketch it out. So he's showing how you would sketch it at the bottom with the sample words, and then the portions up at the top next to the title show the actual strokes you would use in pencil to sort of get you oriented in terms of how you would hold the pencil and how you would turn it and twist it while you use the pressure. What were these styles for scripts? This is an example from Palmer's Penmanship Budget, which was an example, which was a compilation of lettering styles. This is by Joseph Galterio, and this shows the actual style that we recognize today as sort of formal calligraphy in the copperplate or engrossing style. And you'll notice the loops and the joins. Every letter joins to every other letter, and the various forms. In some cases, there's multiple forms of the letter R as well as Z, and other variations in the lowercase f. How did this come out? Well, this is from the Watzkow book, what hand lettering would allow you to do. And again, these are things that can now be interpreted into variable fonts. I don't know if this specific thing's been done yet. although there've been variations in spacing and ascenders and descenders. But here Watzko is showing on the left reduced ascenders and descenders, tight line spacing. On the bottom left, more open spacing, top and bottom, with longer ascenders and descenders. And then on the right, more open spacing or letter spacing, or more open rhythm between the letters, which allows changes in the joins, the lead-in strokes, and things like that. And then the bottom showing that additional spacing between the letters, the wider rhythm, and then combined with the more open line spacing. So you get longer ascenders and descenders and more generous loops. This is the work of Thompson, and this is from his book Script Lettering for Artists. And this is a word mark for Lorillard, P. Lorillard and Company, which is a tobacco company. And what's interesting here, if you look at the word Lorillard, besides being very well designed and nicely lettered, is some of the little things that are going on. So one of them is he's using two versions of the small letter R in the same word. And that may be for variety. It may be because it was meant to be a trademark. You'll notice he has all the caps linked to the word, so it's one continuous stroke almost. But I think the reason for the different first use of the R has to do with the enclosed space under the L and trying to encourage readability. So I think there was a functional reason for that decision to mix two R's in the same word, as well as a reason to make it sort of maybe more trademarkable. These are more examples from Raymond Ballinger showing some of the this is sort of very slick script lettering, a little bit of bounce on the top line, and obviously booze and cigarettes, right? So we get all the legal vices, of course, cigars, and I'm not sure about what the top caption is for, that were being advertised at the time. This is from Gates, and this is interesting because it's very nice, smooth script letter forms. He has left some of the loops open, which is a little non-traditional. And in fact, I think there's some other pages where normally Gates makes sure that he gives you sort of the classical shape, but I think in the scripts, he seems to literally follow some of Kavanaugh's eccentricities, just because he was trying to show that he knew who his forebears were, which is kind of a whole another discussion where there literally was sort of a little rivalry going on between these people. But he's got very nice old style letters here. Those are the numbers, the figures that go above and below. And then he's reminding you there's different forms of some of the small letters. This is back to Kavanaugh from his introduction, and it's a nice example of an even weight script, which definitely was a period style. And he specifically mentions that it could be done with a speedball pen and then touched up. So there is definitely this sense of drawing. It's not strictly handwriting, that these letters were redrawn or fixed or adjusted. And you'll notice here, there's a little trick where there's no dot on the second I in admiration, just the cross stroke on the T. So there's some careful adjustment there. This is another one of Kavanaugh's alphabets. And the way you know it's one of his is that the cap A is a little heavy and a little big, and then the cap I looks a little boring and a little flat. It needs to have some more strokes in it, so it doesn't quite match the rest of the letters. But it's a nice example of a basically even weight brush script with a lot of energy, which was also part of the style at the time. Even one of the well-known modernist designers, Jan Tschichold, mentions brush script in his Treasury of Alphabets and Lettering. It's kind of a unusual example in that he says, well, this stuff was well made, and he contrasts it or matches it with some Chinese, which was meant, I think, in a respectful sense. Tschichold had written about printmaking in Asia, but the fact remains that the structures of our alphabet and the structures of Chinese and the different Asian writing styles are definitely very different. But he's trying to sort of show that there is some point of departure, or at least a reason why we could take brush lettering seriously. And what's really interesting in this book, which has great examples of both lettering and typography, pretty much in a sort of a classy vein, is that this is the only example he gives of informal brush lettering. There is one brush lettered alphabet in that book, but it is a commercial one, but it's a very clean, even, very carefully worked over brush script. So these are some more informal brush lettering. This is all from also from the Ballinger book. And it gives you a better sense of things that are meant to look like handwriting. But if you look closely, or actually it's kind of hard to see, but these are not, maybe a few of them were written as in one go, but these look like handwriting, but they're actually very much paste ups, meaning they would write out the words, they would pick the best letters and they would paste it together and then make it look like it was all written perfectly the first time. That was part of the trick, but what it did was it gave you something that was more perfect than handwriting, but not quite as even and consistent as typography. So it had a bit of life to it, and that was also part of the charm. And for a while, it was very much in fashion. Here's an example. This is for Chase and Sanborn Coffee from Compton Advertising. The reason I bring that up is that about 30 years or so after this ran, I ended up working for Saatchi and Saatchi Compton. This coffee was not being advertised at that point, but I have some more personal recollections about this. But this shows this informal brush script that was very tightly spaced, and this sort of characteristic, sort of, now we consider it maybe a retro style, but you'll notice the letters are actually all slightly different. And that's very much what gives it the liveliness that was very much desired at that point. Watzkow also, in his Art of Hand Lettering, shows examples of brush script, and he mentions obviously that you can have both refinement and force. But if you look at the structure of the cap S, that's something that's kind of interesting because it's different from what we've been looking at. And in fact, David Gates, in his book on lettering, specifically, he's very directive. And obviously some of this is open to interpretation, but he has what he considers a correct form and an incorrect form. And part of it has to do with controlling the strength of the brushstroke, and also starting with a heavier stroke and then backing off a little bit in the middle and then ending it stronger at the end, which can be seen in some ways in brush characters in some of the Asian writing systems. But here he specifically has a top-heavy letter S, and the reason for that is the counter spaces, or the white spaces, are much more open to the before and after the shape, so it links better with whether spaces in words or the next following letters or preceding letters. And that's it's also a more interesting shape to look at. It doesn't feel like a chain so much. It doesn't feel like it's closing in on itself, and that's why a lot of lettering artists preferred the top style and also the brush strokes as recommended here. This is great. This is a caption from Leach's lettering for advertising, and the phrase is, "You can't help but succeed." And of course, the answer is, it's actually a little bit harder than it looks. And this is the kind of detail they would go into. You can look at this and say, but it's all perfect. How could you possibly choose between one and not the other? But there was a very, very specific thing they were looking for. And if you study this, you can get a better sense about what the shapes were that they were seeking. They were looking for open shapes. They're looking for consistency, but they were also looking for open interior shapes. And so literally he's taken the word succeed and going to replace one of the letters in that with something even better. And this Herman Spinedel is the lettering artist here. And you can see at the top that all the letters were literally pasted together and then redrawn. The rough edges were kept, but it was very much an illusion that it was written in one go. But because the letters were so carefully chosen and carefully arranged, it had a life to it that it looked like it had a much more sort of even texture and flow. And this is Gates' example of the brush written small letters. Now, here's probably one of the most famous brush written types, and the one I use for helping promote the show. This is a typeface called Murray Hill, which is named after a neighborhood in Manhattan called Murray Hill. It was designed by Emil Klump, And the reason I mention it is actually there's a department store I used to go into when I was a small child in Alabama, and they used to use this on their posters and their placards. And later, at least a couple sources I've seen claim that Klump was born in Alabama, which I did not know, and went to school there, and then later came to New York and became a lettering artist, which is pretty well documented. And he designed this typeface for ATF, American Type Founders. And this is a 72-point metal example. And I've scanned it in. You can see very clearly that there is the place where the brush comes down. You vary the thickness by lifting and raising the brush as you write the letters. And even the eye dots are meant to look like they're little dots done by just touching the brush on the paper and lifting it back up. And this is very carefully handled, where it looks informal and the letters are not perfect, but they're all sort of perfectly chosen to have a lot of jump and vitality, just like the other letters we were looking at, so that the typeface itself wouldn't look too mechanical. This is another example of a brush written letter. This is from Nerdiger and Beck. And in this case, it's been very carefully refined and has sort of a space age feel to it. But the swells and even some of the sort of the thick joins are what you would get from holding a brush with pigment and then using it with certain kinds of paper. All right, so sans serif letters. So these are constructed, mechanical, maybe not the most beautiful things in the world, but that was the point. They were supposed to look very industrial. This is Raymond Ballinger's example of some constructed capitals, very much working from this geometric idea of breaking up space into 5 zones and then using that as your thickness. And these were things that lettering artists were expected, or commercial artists were expecting to be able to do at the time. This is Watzkow's example, showing how you can take that into sort of generate a whole series of weights by a third of an area, a fourth of an area, a fifth of an area. And there's some adjustments that have to be made here, but this is sort of a very simple idea of sort of stroke weight or thickness, which now we have in the computer in PostScript, and then adapted for letterform design. But in those days, all these would have had to have been drawn. But it did show sort of this idea that sans serifs could be maybe more mechanical in construction or in conception than other forms of type or other forms of hand lettering even. And this is an example of a hand-lettered series of caps from Kavanaugh. There's all sorts of quirks here when you look in detail. But what's nice at that time is the relatively few extra bold sans serifs and extra bold block letters. And so there's definitely a reason where the lettering artists might get called in to work on something like this, because they needed something that, this is what Kavanaugh called power lettering in his introduction. You needed something that could kind of remind people that, don't forget, the sale ends tomorrow. You need to get this stuff right now. So time to pay attention. And Gates was teaching in the late 60s. He had a much more, and by the 60s, he had a much more sophisticated idea, or not much more, he had a sophisticated idea of understanding the difference between letter forms. So again, this is pre-Trajan, but he has as an example of basically a Roman capital letter form or a Trajan letter form as old style proportions, which you would see in a Caslon or a Garamond or a Renaissance era typeface, and then a 19th century or a even width proportion, which you would see in a sans serif. And here you can definitely see the influence of typefaces like Helvetica and Accidens Grotesque being widely adopted for commercial lettering. And this is Gates' sans serif caps, which are consistent set, very nice consistent color. Closed aperture, which means closed openings in the C and the G and the S, and also in the figures and the numbers. So everything's designed to work together. It's even weight, it's balanced, but there's very strong counter spaces or open shapes in the letters, and the thicknesses of this particular style is sort of controlled so that it stands out for the background, but it's not too thin. Ballinger also has a constructed narrow set of capitals. And here in this example, the book actually has a nice tissue bound in above. So this is the tissue over the letter forms, and then you go to the next page, and you can see where the letter forms in the actual black have been slightly adjusted for optical reasons underneath. And so once again, it's this idea of sort of constructed letter forms, but then the sort of admission that the reason why you had a lettering artist or a typeface designer is that you had to make some adjustments to make these letters look as good as possible. This is Gates's flat-sided sans serif, which has now taken some rounded shapes in the B and the P and the R, and they're also flats. They're all additionally forced to flat-sided shapes, but it's very much sort of a coherent relative. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same style, but a coherent relative with the previous set of capitals. And he also shows lowercase letters with his examples, as well as student work. And this is finally, we get to Mortimer Leach again, and this shows his condensed lowercase letters. And once again, there was a need for this because unless you were using, there were some, as I said, there were some photographic letters, alphabets from few limited providers at that time. But Leach's specialty and specialty of the other sort of leading lettering artists was to do sort of a custom designed sans serif. And so this is all very well balanced. It shows Leach's precision and technical ability. And then there's also an interesting point in that the lowercase g has an open shape rather than a closed return at the bottom. So there's some judgment call here about what he thought would be appropriate or what he would suggest for readability or just in terms of character. This is the cover of David Gates's book. So if it looked, first time I saw this, I was kind of disappointed because I thought it would be Helvetica, and then I realized it wasn't. And I was like, oh man, I'm just looking for Helvetica. I want to be a modern designer. And then I realized much later what was interesting was here was his sort of interpretation of that style with a little more liveliness. And this is the cover of his book. And what's interesting about this is the type on the bottom. I think it's in folio. The last phrase is structural systems. And we looked at his chart for capital proportions earlier. And so already by this time, this modernist idea or analytical idea of letter forms as being structural systems rather than as particular styles has really sort of finally kind of made its way into sort of the mainstream of high quality lettering or high quality type design. And this leads to designers that people may have heard of, like Carl Gerstner's design program, programs for design, as well as things that were happening in the larger world at that time, people like Norbert Wiener in developing cybernetics, and also people that influenced design like Herbert Simon. So this idea of structure and systems is now sort of becoming incorporated into letterform and typeface design, where previously it might have been seen as something foreign. These are letter forms from Nerdinger and Beck, and this is their nominal sort of baseline Roman alphabet. And it's interesting because there's a lot of character here. It was very carefully drawn. Maybe it was even drawn for submission for a typeface company. I don't know, a type foundry, but there's sort of an uncial influence if you look at the lowercase o, and this sort of extended sort of rounded, how you would say this, it's an expanded shape, but it's the expansion is toward the top part of the letter, and it sort of narrows for sort of fairly quickly when it goes below the midline, below the middle of the stroke. And the A is unusual too in terms of some of the structure there. So there's a lot of character, and but that's the basic alphabet for their whole book. All right, black letter, got to have a little Gothic lettering, right? So these are examples from Raymond Ballinger. 3 of these are American. The C is from Switzerland. And it shows that Gothic lettering was still actually being used for things like silverware and alcoholic beverages and Christmas advertising, and also hotels in Switzerland. But it was already admitted to be sort of a specialty and something that was not very common. But Kavanaugh did have examples in his book of black letter, of Gothic lettering. And what's curious here, another example of him sort of seeing if you're paying attention, I'm trying to be as charitable as possible, is if you look at the capital N, the left side of the N is much heavier than the right side. The diagonal stroke should be thick because that's the key part of the letter. in this style, but I'm not quite sure why the left and the right don't match. And Kavanaugh kind of gives up the game because elsewhere in the book, he has a letter. You see Shawmut National Bank at the bottom. He has a letter where he does match the left and the right, so he knows the difference. And I guess he wants to make sure you're paying attention, or he wanted to make sure he wasn't outright copied, because obviously he knew if he was going to sketch out the letters, that's what they were supposed to look like. And I have no idea why the other one's the way it was. So finally, this is Leach's example of some of the kind of careful adjustments that lettering artists are supposed to be familiar with in terms of spacing, adjusting the lengths of serifs, occasionally overlapping, but that wasn't really a style yet. And this is why you would hire a lettering designer. And some of Gates' very subtle modifications about shapes and angles. Some of these are matter for interpretation. You might like the middle B as opposed to the right-hand B or the left-hand B. It's not necessarily too narrow. It depends on what you want. But again, there was a very careful sensitivity that was being taught to letter forms. And that was something that was important because these letters would be seen in print. They wouldn't be moving around. And that was part of the culture of the time. And they also weren't, people expected letters to be very well crafted. That was also part of the expectation. So a little bit about when I realized I was interested in lettering, I picked up this book, Lettering for Advertising. And lo and behold, I realized I was working for Saatchi and Saatchi Compton in the late 80s. And that was the successor agency to Compton Advertising. And Calvin Younger was one of the old timers that was still working for the company at that time. And he didn't remember much about this stuff. He'd done it when he was a young art director. I didn't get a lot of chances to talk to him, but it was wild for me. You realize like 30 years later, here I am coming into advertising or working as an assistant type director and this whole bit. And here are people whose work was, being done back in the 50s. So it was pretty wild. And that sort of got me interested into learning more about this when I was working as a typographer. So I didn't usually get involved with hand lettering at that point. So I have a website at peterbaindesign.com, as I should. And just to show you, I have these books are for real. So it's been a nostalgic trip. But sort of understanding where some of the styles that we deal with today came from, and being able to have an appreciation of what came before when you're interested in something that looks old-fashioned. And at this point, I think I want to switch over, and I am going to show you the stuff for real. Okay, here we go. All right. So I think we're good. Yeah. Let's see if we can see this here. This is a book this is a pamphlet actually from the Advertising Typographers of America Association. And these were the folks that were setting typography. And what's amazing to me, this is from a book. I have these books on my table here, so I can actually pull them out. Some of them are under my computer because I was holding my computer up. So I'll just make that little change. So these were the folks that were sort of the competitors for the hand lettering artists. And this is their book on typesetting. Anyway, and in the back of the book was a list of members. So if we go in the back, what's amazing, what you can see here, so I get it out of the light, is that the New York listing is the largest number of members, right? There are some other members, but New York listing is the largest number of members. And if I bring it up even closer, I don't know if it'll work here. Yeah, you can see that some of them are all in the same address, like 113 East 23rd Street. I don't know if you can see that quite as well as I would like. But you'll see the number of them are in the 45th Street, 43rd Street. And literally what was happening was, because the ad agencies were still in the same neighborhood, or most of them were still in the same neighborhood. This is from the 50s. You would literally have typesetters for competing agencies being in the same street or literally in the same building. When I went to work, literally 216 East 45th Street was the same building that photo lettering was in, Techniprocess lettering, which we used a lot, which would transition from being a lettering shop to a typesetter, and also other studios like ad agencies and headliners, which were both custom lettering and typesetting firms, were based there, as well as Art and Type Metro. And so literally you couldn't talk about anything work related in the elevator because you wouldn't know who was who standing with you in the elevator. And literally they were all going to competing companies with their work. So everything had to be carefully packaged. And if you look at some of the addresses here, you realize this is where some of the names for Herb Lubalin and Tom Carnese's typefaces came from. For example, Caslon 540 was this famous Caslon. So when they came up with their Caslon, Lubalin, Smith, and Carnese's Caslon, they named it after Herb Lubalin's studio. Their address was 223. So they became Caslon 223, and the later version from ITC was 224. And more jokes were that the modern typeface released by ITC, designed by Ed Bengat, was modern number 216 after the street address for photo lettering. And I'm going to show you here just an example. This was something I had, Ed Bengat was nice enough to write out for me, talking about the classic days of hand lettering with brush script, and showing the variation you get in the stroke width by stroke thickness by putting the brush down. And then Ed was, I first met him through the Type Directors Club, showing some of the different structures of the letters that you could use that would work with a brush, as well as some of the variations you could get by varying where the strokes went. And then also some of the things to think about when you were joining one letter to another, and how those strokes would relate, so that you could sort of put them together without necessarily having to write everything perfectly the first time and sort of piece it together that way. So that was a nice little tutorial I was able to pick up. I have some other stuff here, but one thing I do want to mention is this is a lettering chart from Phyllis Brown. This was published a little bit after my time period, but evidently the earlier version of this was printed in the 60s, so it definitely would fall in that time period. I mentioned that there was a bit of a conversation between some of the lettering artists. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is interesting. This is the Kavanaugh book showing his formal script, which by and large is pretty good. There's one or two quirks in it, but what's amazing is this is the thing I thought, talk about funny little details, where there's a K with a little ball terminal at the end. Y'all see that, right? Well, guess what? What does David Gates do in his lettering book? Because all of these lettering artists have been so fussy. They've been spending their entire career doing exactly the same type styles of lettering for the clients, all making them look perfect. So he has the same funny little ball terminal at the end of his K that Kavanaugh does, just to see if they're paying attention. So anyway, I'm going to end it at that point. And Alex, it's up to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I really appreciate seeing like the physicality. So I'm really glad that we're able to show some of these books through the magic of Zoom, these overhead cameras. So it's super fun. I'll read off a couple of questions and we'll keep kind of this feed going. Okay. Maybe like actually before we do that, I had like a question. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I had a question about, and I'll read the next question, but kind of thinking about the practice of studying. So in terms of these books and when these works were created, they're essentially meant for learning how to do lettering, right? So in kind of a more commercial setting. Can you talk a little bit about like the career paths in a way, like for sort of that mid-century model of like you would go to high school and like what would sort of be the expectation? Like how would you see yourself kind of, landing? What would be the roles that you could take on?
Yeah, the one, just in terms of getting one sense, there's one thing I read from the mid 50s. Somebody estimated there were about 200 lettering artists working at that point. That sounds like a lot, but it's not really, right? Because New York is already probably a city of 2 million people, or five, however big it was. So I don't think people really thought of it as a career. I think artists that were looking for employment, did what they had to do. Quentin Fiore, who later designed Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Massage, right? So he worked as a lettering artist. And I think at least in one of his interviews, he said the reason he became a designer was it was really tough to make ends meet. So I think economically, unless you were a Tommy Thompson or a Kavanaugh or a Gates or an Ed Bengat or somebody like that, it was definitely an art studio job. You didn't have to have a college degree. You had to be fast. You had to have really good hand skills. And you had to, you might just start, as a messenger, right? In those days, you remember there's no fax. This is pre-fax. This is everything. Everything's on the phone or messenger, right? Or telegraph, right? So you pick up the phone, you say, this is, so-and-so studio, what do you need? And then they well, here's what I need, blah, blah, blah. Little haggling about how much money it's going to cost. Can I get it tomorrow? Can I see sketch this afternoon? We're kind of busy right now. Well, maybe I can give you a little more money, and all that stuff. And because when I started in the 80s, in the late 80s, I mean, the Mac was already out, but it wasn't really being used yet with PageMaker for real page design. We were still trying to turn around typesetting in 4 hours. And so that gives you an idea how fast these lettering people had to do. So maybe you would have a couple hours for a sketch. You'd send the sketch over to the client. They'd approve it. They'd say which one they wanted. And then you might have maybe a day to turn it around. People that work for George Abrams could tell you it was very, very fast paced. And the career path in those days was, nobody was a type designer, right? There were very few people working for type foundries. There were very few type foundries, right? With line of type, intertype, and ATF, right? Coming out of World War II, right? So, Ludlow in Chicago, right? And then with the birth of phototype, you started to have phototype sending coming. So most of the designers that were outside of these type companies, like Jerry Croft in that time period, Thompson, they were all, Charlie Hughes, I think, designed typefaces for ATF in the post-war period. They were all working designers, lettering designers. And so, and it was a pretty high bar in the sense that not only did they have to have a regular sort of job, but the type companies, remember, it was a big investment for them to release new typefaces because they were still being cut in metal, or there were a lot of production steps, like which Matthew Carter has talked about, that went into producing the early photo composition typefaces. So you have this, pretty big overhead you had to sort of get through or be approved, that investment before the typeface would be commissioned, and then before it would be produced, and then it would be released. And that's what was so important with studios like photo lettering, technique process lettering, which I know a lot about, studios like Headliners and Lettering Inc., because they had photographic lettering systems, some of them which were just photographic cut and paste systems, but they had built up libraries of alphabets. They had lots of cameras, so they could do things that were sort of in between type, but not quite as flexible as hand lettering, and also typically they wouldn't make a custom weight for you, unless you had more time and things like that. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, and there's a question that sort of prompted me to ask this question that kind of foregrounds that, but there was a question from Graham, one of our students, who wants to know about the structure of ad agencies in relationship to lettering. Was there a letterers in a given department? Sort of, if you could talk about like how the letterers were positioned within advertising agencies.
Right. So I think it's there remember the whole reason for the position of the type director was that there ended up being production people that specialize as typographers. And I was looking through one of these books, and there's even reference to a woman whose name I haven't seen before, Lydia Carter. It's in this book. I have to look at the page. There were sort of typographers working in the ad agencies, but remember, you didn't want all that typesetting equipment. You couldn't justify. That's a bad typesetting joke. You couldn't necessarily put maybe a magazine which had a lot of typesetting would have their own typesetting in-house, but ad agencies, because of the model, were sending everything out, right? So the art director, this is also the time period of the creative revolution, right? So prior to the creative revolution, the art director was not very important. The copywriter ruled the roost, and also it was sort of the grand era. I mean, I haven't watched all the Mad Men episodes, but the grand era of sort of the generic ad, right? You have these sort of standard layouts, like this book of 101 roughs, right? And this is, you want to know what an ad looks like? This is what an ad looks like. Here, you want another one? Here, we got another one for you, right? And then we got another one here. And guess what? The logo is still on the bottom, right? Yeah, this is it. Look, oh, here we have a big, a big picture, right? And then we have another one. Yeah. So it was definitely formulaic. Although people, there were people doing the interesting stuff. And there were designers that were doing advertising design that were doing good work. But before the creative revolution, that was, Paul Rand was, he was groundbreaking, right? It was at the Weintraub Agency, all those places. So it wasn't until things like DDB and the Volkswagen campaign, I did work with people in the late 80s that had worked with Helmut Krohn at Doyle Dane. And these art directors really became designers. They started doing tissues and tracings. They started taking control of the lettering process, and they weren't just sort of sending out for headlines. But the type director's role traditionally was you sent out for a headline, which is what I used to do, and body text. And the headline would go to a headline shop because they made it look good, and the body text would go to a body copy shop, which would do better typesetting than just sort of generic stuff. But they would that's how that stuff would work. And so to get back to answer the flow question, so you would have, depending on how the agency was set up prior to the creative revolution, I don't know a lot about this, but art directors a lot of them were more sort of layout people. They weren't really responsible for the creative concept of the ad. Stuff started with the client and the copywriter. Later, in a creative format, which is what I was working under, the art director would have a copywriter, and they would be a team, and they would both, sort of concept stuff. Those concepts would get approved. Then it would go out for typesetting and photography and illustration, and the pieces would come together. The same thing would also happen, obviously, for television, right? Because there was a lot of hand lettering for TV titles for early TV titles, also obviously movie titles. And so everything would be storyboarded. Storyboards would be approved, the script would be approved. And then you would have what they would call TV supers, or things for superposition, where you would have headline lettering or hand lettering done, and then it would be superimposed on either originally in the film and later in the video channel when they were doing the final cuts of the video for advertising. So that's how the text was brought into the spots. But basically it was a creative process. Then you would have copy approval, and then it would go out for production and final tweaking and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of like some of these books, like where, like you think like the purpose of these books was like for like self-study, I mean, clearly like this is a craft that requires training and actually like working with people as an apprentice basically, but like
Right.
Would these be kind of gateways for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you look at I mean, we can mention lots of lettering artists or lettering designers, people like Tom Carnase and things like that, or even designers like, I'm just picking on the Cooper stuff, like Paul Standard, who taught at Cooper, right? So for some people it was and something that they picked up as part of their art training that later they became a specialist in, right? I think a lot of these books were basically meant to get art directors and designers up to speed enough that if they cared and they had the time and the budget, they would either do it themselves or work with a specialist. So the expectation was not that everybody was going to be at this level. Very few people were. But there were people that, I mean, there are plenty of designers that did their own lettering at different levels of skill. And you can find lots of examples of, mediocre lettering and samples of really good lettering. I'm just trying to think of their other things I could show you. But I think the main market for these books, remember, was type was always expensive. Fonts were not free on your computer. That was why you had rub down lettering, right? Was because there was this great demand just for something that looked like a letter that you could put into a layout. And this is all prior to that. And then obviously when rub down lettering and Letraset came in, it starts to change the equation. And even David Gates mentions that by that point, most lettering is done in typesetting, and hand lettering sort of a specialty at that point.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna take like a couple more questions. There's a few related questions. You touched. There's a question about kind of the film lettering for film, which you touched on. I would imagine like
Right.
basically it's like it's the same kind of track. You could say like the same artists who are learning how to letter would land in all these different places, like would get commissions and would sort of be in the market for lettering. But there's a couple of questions in terms of like Stephen Cole asked a question and Kevin Thompson, a sort of related question, but Stephen's question was, when did lettering training fade from design schools and whether it's coming back? There's obviously a lot of hunger for it, and most folks learn independently these days. When do you think it faded, and when do you think if it's coming back?
I'll leave when it's coming back up to the people that are teaching in their various design programs. I know you teach some lettering in type of Cooper, so I'll leave it at that. I know that most, although maybe not all, of the specialized typeface design programs now have at least some exposure to hand lettering. And there are schools that where they do have occasional people that teach lettering in book arts, right? And in other sorts of contexts. And obviously what happened, I did see something in the chat. People mentioned the Leach book. There's actually 2 Leach books that people should be aware of. This is the other one, Letter Design in the Graphic Arts, which is really wonderful. And then the other one, which is maybe more famous now, that's the one I had stuck under my laptop. So there we go. And that's this one, Lettering for Advertising. But I think what mainly transitioned out in terms of sort of maybe the more elite or sort of the more business-focused design programs or advertising programs was they switched over from hand lettering to typesetting. And then the typesetting, programs that were so well, had a lot of resources, they got rid of their metal typesetting and switched over to the Macintosh. So that's when that happened. I think that's been pretty well documented. I'm sure, that I guess Cooper's unusual in that you've kept a little bit of letterpress, I believe, right? But a lot of schools, they threw out the letterpress, and it was only when people brought, book arts back to some schools that they brought the Vandercooks back and things like that. But it was simply, there was no need for it. You made the transition from letterpress to offset, and from metal type to phototype setting. And for phototype setting, a lot of schools were just teaching comping because you would never set your own text. You just sort of rough it in, and you had to know how much text would fit in a page. And, magazines like Rolling Stone, they would just, they would have an idea of how many pages they had. And they knew from their body text, from their typesetter, and from experience how long the text would run. So you say, well, it's going to be about, 20 column inches over 3 pages. So they knew, then they could start playing around with the layout. So there was no reason to have in-house typesetting unless that was a financial or a production decision. So I think some of that training went away. And also remember, you had pre-Macintosh, you had typesetters. It was a regular job, right? So, you could sort of outsource it. So you didn't have to have that. Does that sort of wrap it up?
Yeah, and actually, it touches on another question from someone who said that I still make my students comp their raw by hand, although I know I'm a dying breed. I know my reasons for doing so, but would like to hear what you think are some of the best reasons to continue to comp layouts manual before jumping on the computer.
Yeah. When I've taught sort of print design, um, in the past, I have had students do thumbnails, but I haven't had them do or do conceptual sketches. I haven't had them do, let's say, full-size comps. But whenever I teach a lot of times, I don't want to say all the time, but most times when I have taught typography in a semester format, I have always tried to get students used to drawing some letters by hand, because I think there's definitely sort of a kinesthetic relationship between letterform structure. And I think there's a certain sensitivity, and even having to sketch or even trace something, I mean, I'm just using again, the zombie modernism fonts like Helvetica and Univers, something more contemporary, jumping into the 90s like Meta, or, some of the newer sans faces from various foundries. I'm trying not to pick favorites. Just having to trace those would at least give the students a better idea of what structure is or what it can be. And because I think unless you've literally traced it out or had to visualize it or sketched it freehand, you really don't know what the shapes look like. You don't know what the possibilities are to change it. You don't have as much sensitivity to letterform shapes. And I think comping, whether it also includes comping illustration or photography, in a sense, if it is going to be a print design, or maybe it's a storyboard, or maybe it's a UX or a UI issue, you have a sense of what kinds of relationships you're hoping to get. And obviously digital media is very different. It's much more flexible. Motion design, it's not fixed, so you have to design a different way. But if you want to have control over those relationships, one way to build sensitivity is definitely drawing. Because the other way to do it is just to do it a zillion times using contemporary tools, which is also a way to do it. Because the old letterpress printers, they weren't necessarily trained. A lot of them, maybe the more successful designers were trained in art, but you set type a zillion times and you look at it a zillion times. And if you have someone point out what works and what doesn't, then you can start your progress forward. But that's a long, hard way to learn. So,
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, also, I guess there's a kind of an interesting follow-up question I could paraphrase, which from Kevin Thompson, in terms of hand lettering experiencing a renaissance, as he says, and essentially the question is because there's so much hand lettering being done now, and people
Right.
are trying to teach themselves, is it kind of at this point more quantity over quality until is it the next question is it too soon to tell?
And put the reduce, reuse, recycle up here. So yeah, I mean, I was fortunate, and then I studied pen lettering when I was an undergraduate, right? And I was interested in hand lettering, and then I worked as a typographer, right? So I had both sides of it, right? And now I know there's just, I'm not, I don't look at stuff every day. I know there's amazing stuff out there, and I see some of it when it kind of bubbles to the top. I think the challenge I would like to see is I'd like to see more of this out in the real world, right? I understand a lot of it's fun because it just exists in the digital environment. I think that's where the whole thing about hand painted stuff has really taken off, and people want to be in a space or have something that they can feel sort of the human aspect of. And I think that's where it's definitely come back. I think there's a less interest in this sort of or maybe there's growing interest, I don't know, in this sort of very well trained sort of apprenticeship, or just learning how to, these are rough sketches, but really learning how to manipulate forms and manipulate weights, the way people are used to drawing on the computer, but doing it by hand and using it for handwork, as opposed to the process of, let's say, developing a typeface or a word mark or some sort of other graphic, an icon set or something like that. So it is interesting to see this stuff come back. I think the whole sort of modern lettering style is really interesting because most people use it as fonts, but it began with, what is it? Molly Thorpe or whoever, she wrote one of these books on lettering, and it's all this sort of it's sort of the script as if you hadn't studied traditional script, and it's got all these bouncing shapes in it. And it's very different from the sort of traditional script, but the whole thing took off because people realized they could do it and they weren't intimidated by it. Whereas these more traditional forms, I think, are really, obviously, once you get into it, if you want to do some mastery, you realize, oh, well, I can't just bang it out. I got to start learning how to, balance these shapes and, all that sort of thing. So, it's a whole, it's sort of climbing that, deciding, how much, how many mountains do you want to climb, and, how much time do you have, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's also like, it's something you mentioned, like, you showed me an example of something where, like, it's an example in one of the books, but it's like, it's not done perfectly. It's almost like makes it feel like you could do this, right? It's like you open up this book and it's like, oh, maybe I can do this, right? Like there's a lower bar expectation.
Right. So, I mean, I think that was part of my calligraphy training. Was the lettering book we had wasn't, it was, in some ways it was worse than Kavanaugh because it was all hand lettered, and there's some things that were just, I could tell. I mean, I'd played around with lettering. I was younger. I could tell that there's things that weren't quite right. And I was like, well, I could do a better job. Yeah. And so I think part of that is just being willing, it's like people taking up cooking now. It's like we have, you can order whatever you want on your phone. And, you now can go to the grocery store and get, kiwis from New Zealand or, whatever. You can get local produce. How about that? You can get local produce. And, heirloom tomatoes and anything else, fancy schmancy stuff you want. And you can go to Walmart, you can get organic, if I'm going to drop them, you can get organic produce at Walmart, but sometimes it's nice to be able to raise it yourself or cook it yourself. So I think there's definitely a nice analogy there.
Yeah. Or the sourdough bread.
Sourdough bread. Yeah. I'm trying to avoid the whole make sourdough fonts, I guess. But yeah, exactly. I mean, I could pull out that lettering sample and we could sort of pick it apart. So yeah, I mean, I was looking in the Q&A. Let me see here. Yeah, so I think we answered the ad agency one, comping, culture history of film credit hand lettering. I really don't know much about film credit hand lettering. There was a wonderful exhibit from stuff done at Pacific Title in Los Angeles, and I think part of the issue with the film lettering, why it hasn't really been publicly promoted, is it all belongs to the movie studios, and they're very good at understanding, what they've created and the value of what they created. So part of the issue, I know there's the Art of the Title site, which is great, which I've used. And there's a little more openness now in title design and things like that. But I think the older movie stuff, I don't know what was preserved. That's the first issue. And the other thing I heard is that a lot of it's in the motion picture archives, and that is not, they don't publish that stuff. So I think part of the problem is that if you see these wonderful film title, hand lettered film titles, black and white or 50s, 60s, things like that, North by Northwest, right? So it's Alfred Hitchcock and Saul Bass. Well, I think North by Northwest looks like it's hand lettered or based on type, and then he made some changes to it. It's like, well, is that artwork still around? It's like, well, that's a very good question. And, so I think that's definitely stuff that probably other people can get into. It's definitely out there. There were some very skilled people doing it. There was there have some calligraphers. I know Jill Bell did some presentation at TypeCon about hand letterer, worked for Saul Bass and some other people. I think it's Arthur Goodman is one of the names that comes up in the Leach books. There were definitely people out in the LA area can get more info on that. Also, like people that work for Disney, it did, the signage for, I'm sure a lot of the original Disney stuff was all hand done. I don't think it was typeset. So when they designed the parks and things like that, there was probably, and there is a tradition also, some of the sign painters, some of the Las Vegas casinos had custom done signage. And I know there's the Boneyard and things like that. So there's a lot of different aspects of that people can get into, learn more about. So
I think there's only one last question from Jim
Ah,
Siegel.
do
Hi,
you
Jane.
do any of your own hand lettering, right? So the answer is yes. Yes, I do. And I want to do more of it. And so, yeah, so I haven't really shown a lot of my own stuff. Anyway, but yeah, I've been doing script workshops, studying the stuff, doing it. I have some more samples I can send people. I have some stuff on my website. I have more things I need to put on the website. Yeah, definitely. Somebody mentioned, oh, it needs to, it's in the chat. It should be in the Q&A. Anyway, yeah, so there were definitely women. They were not prominent, unfortunately, but they did work. And for example, people like Ursula Seuss, who I've written about, she had typefaces that she designed for film. So that's definitely something that was, there were some women that got prominence.
And I think there's also more and more research these days, fortunately, like into more women active and more of the collections. And so there's going to be,
Right.
I imagine in the next few years, there's going to be more books published and more websites, more articles about them.
Right.
So.
And yeah, I mean, I have some resources on my website, links to stuff. I have stuff on the H Commons page. And there's a fair amount of information online now, which is great too. And so definitely people should reach out if they have questions. I'd be happy to try and answer them in the future.
Yeah. Well, amazing. I think this is like a really great note to end on, right exactly at 8 o'clock. So thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your insight, your knowledge, and kind of a journey through these wonderful books. And thank you for putting together the bibliography. So I pasted that into the link. Hopefully people have had a chance. This is like a really great way to share that. So thank you for everyone for coming, for being with us. And again, thank you, Peter. We immensely appreciate this ability to kind of link us all together. So thank you again, and we'll see you all in the summer, in June and July. So look for more lectures, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Have a great evening. Stay safe.